Alan, I think both of us would agree that one of the major problems in the whole Medicare area, closely connected with the present crisis, is the practice we've gotten into of having the employer, in the main, be responsible for people's health care. Now, I know that that wasn't always the case. When I was growing up in the 1920s and 30s, that was not the practice, or at least it was very rarely the practice. How did we ever get into that silly business? No, I say silly, because I see no more reason why employers should provide in-kind health care than why they should provide food or clothing or housing. And when we had company towns, people objected to that. Why don't they object now? What is it? How did we get into this practice?
Well,
when did it start?
Well, we stumbled into it.
How?
Well, back in the 30s, there was virtually no employer-provided health insurance. Right. Health insurance was growing up under the sponsorship of the Blue Cross and Blue Shields, which were hospital and doctor-created associations to assure that there was a financing vehicle to get their bills paid for them. The way employers got into it really was during World War II, that the government was spending some 45% of the gross national product and created a tremendous excess demand for labor and was trying to hold down wages, and so there were...
When you say trying to hold down wages, stop. You mean the government had wage and price control.
Yes,
They
right.
set a limit on the wages that employers
Exactly.
could pay.
And so in the face of excess demand, pushing against these wage and price controls, and another important factor that came into this was the growth of organized labor. Recall that back in the 30s with the Wagner Act and all that, organized labor became a much larger and more important force in our economy. So those forces came together in World War II with unions demanding wage increases.
But whether unions had been demanding wage increases or not in a booming economy,
sure,
the employers would have tried to find some way to attract workers.
Right. And so the government, not wanting to yield on the wage and price controls, said you may give health insurance as a fringe benefit.
Well, was it the government's idea that health insurance should be the fringe benefit? It must have been that the employers thought of the idea of health insurance as a fringe benefit as something they could use.
Well, I think coming from the side of the unions, that health benefits have always been a wonderful source of bargaining prizes. You know, stick with me, boys. Last year I got you free doctor visits. This year I'll get you hearing aids and crutches, and next year I'll get you wheelchairs. And so I think that, you know, as a source of wonderful sounding bargaining prizes, it's always been great for organized labor. But basically, as I understand it, that was it, that the government said, you can't increase the wages, but we will accede to your demands to have employers provide health insurance.
That will not be regarded as a violation of wage control.
Right.
But should it not have been taxed?
Well, again, the way so many things happen in the Internal Revenue Code, you know, it wasn't a policy, it just happened, and that is, employers started paying for health insurance, and since the Internal Revenue Code was silent on the subject, they didn't pay tax on it. It was untaxed. Then,
and partly, if I have to add my own personal note here, I was involved in 1941 and 42 in developing withholding at source, which involved W-1s. The ubiquitous form. My wife has never forgiven me for my involvement, but it involves that every employer has to file a form.
Right.
And undoubtedly, when we drew up those forms, we never took into account at all that there was going to be health insurance.
Right.
So it called for cash wage payment.
right, and so cash wages were taxed, but not health insurance. It just, the law was silent, so they didn't pay taxes on it. Then, when the issue came up, for example, in the Internal Revenue Code of 1954, by then...
54?
Yeah.
You mean it didn't come up till then?
As I recall, there was a certain amount of questioning of it, but it was sustained but not codified.
So that was 9 years it lasted.
And by then, the practice of tax-free employer-provided health insurance was so widespread, so many millions of people were getting so much money from it, that politically it would have been impossible to tax it. So it just, you know, it was a thin end of the wedge, if you like. It just grew, And there it
Well,
was.
didn't the IRS make some efforts to tax it at that
I think
time?
so.
And then
But
did
they were on-
Congress explicitly pass a law exempting it?
In the Internal Revenue Code of 1954, in sections 105 and 106, Congress explicitly excluded from taxable incomes employer contributions, first to health insurance and then to just health benefits.
It's always fascinated me, not about this issue alone, but about so many cases, how something gets started for one reason and
Mhm.
ultimately develops in something altogether different,
Right,
and yet once it develops, you can't get rid of it.
that's right.
It's what my wife and I called in the title of one of our books, The Tyranny of the Status Quo.
Hmm.
Y-
Yeah,
It's much easier to make a mistake than it is to correct a mistake.
yeah,
That's true for individuals too. It's very easy to bang your car up, but it's not so easy to fix it after you have.
yeah.
So that's how it got to be the practice of employers.
And then that became, for a time, the second largest by dollar volume and by number of people affected, the largest federal health insurance program. That is the tax subsidies to employer-provided health insurance.
Sure.
And nobody ever had that in mind at all when they passed that legislation.
Sure.
It just happened. It grew.
Now, on the other hand, as I understand it, under present law, if I or any other individual, self-employed or independent, not employed, buys insurance or pays for his health care, that only gets deductible if his total costs exceed a specified fraction of his total income. That is, on the income tax, I think, what is it now, 5%?
Is it 5 or 7? I'm not sure.
I think it's 5%. It
Is it
used to be
5%?
3%, then it was raised to 5%. It may have been raised again for all
Yeah.
I know. So that there's an enormous incentive for an individual who is employed to have the employer continue to do it.
That's right. And if you think back to pre-1986, when many, many people were in the 50% marginal tax bracket, counting the federal, the state income taxes are in this, and the payroll taxes also. I remember about 1978 or 9, a young woman graduating from Stanford was asking me for job advice, and I was asking her about the pay and the different options, and that night I thought, gee, I wonder, for this young lady stepping off of the farm and into the job market, what's going to be her marginal tax bracket? And to my amazement, I computed it, and it was over 50% when you
Not surprised.
when you
Sure.
count the payroll
Payroll
taxes and the
taxes and-
state income tax
Sure,
and the federal, and
sure.
you combine them. And so it makes an enormous difference to have your employer pay for it.
Sure, what it means is that if you pay for it, for every dollar you pay for it, your employer can afford to pay, that is, instead of giving you $1 in wages, well, I should put it differently. If he gives you $1 in wages, you have left maybe 50 cents,
Right.
because after you've paid your taxes. If he gives you $1 in medical care, you get $1.
Right.
I won't say you get $1 worth of medical care,
No.
but you get $1 spent on medical care.
Right. It's a very important distinction.
A very important
important.
distinction.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And that's surely one of the major reasons why costs have gone up as much as they have.
I think so.
Now, the question then comes down, what can we do about it? My own utopian preference, if I had my way, I would like to return to what I think is the right system, eliminate the tax exemption of employer-provided medical care. If you eliminated the tax exemption to the recipient of employer-provided medical care, you would establish a very strong incentive for workers and employers to agree on a different method of wage payment. In that case, the worker would have an incentive to have the employer pay him the equivalent of what the employer is now spending on medical care, have the employer pay it to him in cash and let him manage his own medical care, because he could then decide rationally how much he wanted to buy and what it was worth. But you will tell me, and you will be correct, that that's a dream in the sky, pie in the sky, that given the present political situation, there's not a chance of a snowball in hell that you can get that done. So I wonder whether you don't agree that a second best solution, not the best solution, but a second best solution would be to establish medical IRAs. That is to say, have a situation under which John Jones, the employee, in return for the employer not providing medical care directly, the employer deposits in a special medical IRA account for John Jones, the employee, let's say 10% of his salary, whatever may be the average cost that he's now incurring for medical care. And that is deposited there free of tax and free to accumulate without paying tax on interest it earns or anything. And then that ends the employer responsibility for medical care. He's discharged it by paying this fee. And then the employee can use that sum as he wants. If he wants to join an HMO, he can. If he wants to buy insurance, he can. If he wants to operate on a direct pay, he goes to the physician and pays him his fee, he can. It would seem to me that that ought to be politically feasible and much more sensible than our present system.
Well, one of the things I've learned in the past decade or two working on this problem is that incrementalism is one of the first laws of our democracy, and that whatever idea you bring to the policy process, they put it through the blender and cut it up into very fine pieces, and so that I think that that would be seen as a very radical
But isn't
change.
It's fairly incremental.
Well,
we have other kind of, we have an IRA. It's building on a standard pattern, and put it a different way. Suppose that alternative were presented to workers. It wouldn't be compulsory.
mm-hmm.
But suppose that alternative were presented to workers. My guess is that 90% of them would vote to do it.
Well, let me come back to the employment basis of health insurance. While I agree that that's got a lot wrong with it, and if we were starting afresh now, that's not the way we would go. We wouldn't want people to lose their health insurance when they lose their job, arguably when they need it the most.
You see, you speak always, stop me.
Yeah.
I got to stop you, because everybody in this business speaks as if health insurance is the way health should be provided, health care.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's absurd. I think what people need is a major medical insurance thing,
mm-hmm.
but that the better way for ordinary health care is for people to buy health care the way they buy food and clothing and housing, by going to the physician and making an agreement with him and paying him his fee directly between patient and physician.
But here, the problem with that, Milton, is that today healthcare expenses are highly concentrated. In any given year, something like 70% of the dollars will be accounted for by 10% of the patients or less.
But that would be taken care of by having a major medical.
Okay, so the important, if you're saying it would be a good idea to structure it so that people were much more cost conscious, acted like they're using their own money for those things that people could reasonably budget for, sure, that makes a lot of sense. But there would remain, what do you do about the 70% of the dollars that are spent on the 10% of the people who have the highest costs? And we need to bring some kind of incentive.
If you have major medical insurance,
yeah,
that 70% would come out of the major medical insurance.
But now we have to talk about how do we structure that major medical insurance in such a way that once people are caught up in that, there is still some incentive for somebody to treat the patient in the most economical way.
By having those be private insurance corporations who have every incentive to do that.
Okay.
And no different from the
mm-hmm.
fire insurance, life insurance, and other things.
Yeah.
So let's go back.
So we'd want a regime in which health insurers were able to contract selectively with doctors and the hospitals that they thought were efficient and effective.
No.